Shalom. This is the sixth class of the History of Israel series. Today we're going to be discussing it's called in the clouds of the war and the Jewish-Arab confrontation. It's interesting that, this is a period that we're going to be covering the period from 1930 to 1939. Just before the war. And during this period is marked by two major pronouncements by the British commissions, both called white papers, one in 1930 and one in 1939. The white paper of 1930 is called the Passfield, P-A-S-S field, Passfield, by the name Lord Passfield, the Secretary of the Cabinet, who headed this committee. And the other one is in 1939, and we will discuss both white papers. The white papers were essentially pronouncements of the British in trying to resolve the problem of what they saw in Palestine. And today we're going to be discussing essentially what is the major problem. When the British made that Balfour Declaration to establish a Jewish home in Palestine, Jewish homeland, a national home, rather, in Palestine. They were not totally aware of what was happening with the Arabs. The Arabs were, even though they were a large part of the population, there were no nationalist sentiments among them. Besides, the Arabs had, several countries already. They're Iraq, they have Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, Syria. All of these were major locations. Palestine was a very tiny area. So the concept of putting the Jews there is logical until the Arab violence started to emerge. When the Arab violence, and this is one of the major points that I want to take from this section. Arabs learn that violence pays off. And whenever they want something, they attack, they kill, they terrorize. And the response of all the people, the weaker people in the world, is to appease them, hoping that by giving them what they want or acquiescing to some of their demands, the violence will go away. It's like any bully in any society. And that's what I think the world has done. The two elements that I think have been constant in the relationship with the Arabs and in the creation of the State of Israel till this very day. One of them is Arab intransigence, the refusal of the Arab world to recognize, to accept that the Jews have a right to be in the land of Israel. It is something that has gone throughout the whole period. And the way they react by this intransigence is by violence at different intervals and different forms, whether it's the way the Palestinians and the hijackings, the airplane hijackings, or knife, or anyway, it's violence. The second element that we're going to see is the cowardice of the governments who begin to feel that there's no way to solve the problem, and they have to give in to the Arab demands and reduce the rights of the Jews. That is a constant. So if you want to make peace, give the Arabs more land, give the Jews less land. That's the constant element. And in all the state, as I mentioned in this that I'm going to be with this lecture, in all the state departments, whether it's in America or in Britain or in France, the constant element that is universal is that the Arabs have more right, and that to be fair, we have to give the Arabs more than we give the Jews. It's also the concept that the Jews, what are they going to do if we don't acquiesce to them? What are they going to do? The Jews are weak, cowardly. They're not going to go fighting. And so the states give in. This is the subject of this lecture today. After the great and terrible riots of 1929, the British, in their great wisdom, who had promised the Jews a national homeland in Palestine, they issued this pass-failed white paper. Number one, assigning equal blame to the Jews and to the Arabs for the riots, where the Arabs had initiated it, killed Jews, massacred them, especially in Hebron, and the British did not assign blame to them. They simply, as they say today, we have to stop the cycle of violence or the mutual hatred. And so the Jews begin to realize, and as a commission result, they said that the Arabs were not at fault; it was just spontaneous, whereas the riots of 1929 were premeditated and planned by the Mufti of Jerusalem, and so the Jews begin to feel. Even the white paper comments that the work the Jews have done in Israel, which by 1930 Jews had done enormous progress, economic, financial, infrastructure, agricultural, economic, everything that they had done in those 30 years since they started the Aliyah, they speak about them in disparaging terms, putting them down. So, and one of the final things is the Arabs are claiming that there are too many Jews in Israel and Palestine. We're going to limit Jewish immigration. That's in 1930. We see that this is a very serious problem. The Jews are very disappointed with this paper, and they begin to realize that they no longer have the support of Britain. The great love affair between the Britain and the Jews that started with the Balfour Declaration in 1917 comes to a crushing end in 1930. Ben-Gurion, who is the representative of the Jewish Agency at that time, says that the problem is the Jews are too weak. We need to strengthen Jewish self-defense. And I want to point out something about the self-defense, that a very important person rises in the Jewish world, somebody who had been already very active in Jewish affairs from the First World War, Vladimir Jabotinsky, who begins to say that Arab hostility is inevitable and there's no solution. Ben-Gurion talks about self-defense, but believes that some solution can be acquired. And then there are other Jews who believe that we should have a binational state. I want to point out here a few of these people. There was an organization called Brit Shalom that believed that we could do business with the Arabs. The rector of the Hebrew University, Yehuda Lev Magnes, also the famous philosopher Martin Buber. So all of them, they were, particularly the German intellectuals, believed that we could have brotherhood with the Arabs. Jabotinsky and others realized that it's never going to happen. And in fact, Jabotinsky, because of his disillusion with the response of the Jewish people, he creates a new party called the Revisionist Party, and he creates even a paramilitary organization called the Irgun Tzva'i Leumi, they're called the Etzel, which eventually we're going to hear about later. Although some people used to call him a fascist, Ben-Gurion referred to him as Vladimir Hitler, so it shows the enmity between them. But he hoped for, on the contrary, he hoped for an emergent middle class, because the bourgeoisie is the enemy of the police state, and who the socialists are globalists, and the bourgeoisie is the ideologues of individualism. But the hostility between Ben-Gurion and Jabotinsky is so severe that we will know that Jabotinsky would not even stay in Israel until 1940 to come to the United States. He was died and buried in New York until eventually he was brought back to Israel. This was the great enmity between the two parties. So we see here the emergence of really three movements in Israel with regard to the Arabs. The most peaceful the idea that we're creating a confederation with the Arabs and that we're going to have peace with them. The idealists, Martin Buber and others, Brit Shalom. And then we have the Zionist, the Jewish agency in the leadership of the Zionist movement, Ben Gurion and others who believe that although we want to make some arrangements with the Arabs, but we have to be strong. They were not like the Brit Shalom, and they were not thinking of a confederation. They were thinking of a Jewish state, but with some arrangements with the Arabs. And then there was Jabotinsky, who is at the other extreme, saying not only do we have to have strength, but we also have to even control not only one side of the Jordan, but even the other side, where the British had given the Germans, the Arabs a state. So you have these great tensions. I mean, Jabotinsky really wanted everything. It was a maximalist approach, whereas the Zionists wanted more of a gradualist approach. And Jabotinsky creates this youth movement called the Beitar youth movement, which all over the world also upholds this maximalist point of view. The tensions between the groups were so severe that in 1933, one of the leaders of the Zionist movement, Chaim Arlozorov, who was director of the Jewish Agency's political department, was shot and killed while strolling with his wife on the Tel Aviv seashore, probably, and was accused by a revisionist who was arrested and accused of the murder. This fratricidal hatred between the revisionism and labor was a very sad schism in the Jewish people. Let me talk a little bit about what was happening in society at that time. Capitalism, in addition to all the kibbutzim that we had spoken about it in the previous class, the capitalism grows in Tel Aviv. The citrus grows, continues to exports continue to grow. The German immigrants, particularly, were very successful. New urban centers. The issue is it's larger and wealthier. I want to just read to you a beautiful sentence of how the world was looking at the Jewish people in Israel, in Palestine at that time. The schoolboy in Bucharest, the tailor in New York's garment district, the disillusioned intellectual in Vienna, all were moved by the vision of a bronzed new race of Jews who spoke their own Hebrew language, plowed their own fields, loaded their own rifles, sang their own anthems, and never hushed their voices or looked back in fear over their shoulders. They were the palpable accomplishments that kindle the imagination and hopes of Jews all over the world. Beautiful. This is actually what was happening in Israel, in Palestine, in this time. Now, I want to point out that Ben Gurion, among other things, who wanted to also a Jewish state, very much like Herzl, who realized that the Jews in Europe were going to be suffering. We already, this is after we have the Nuremberg laws and Hitler came to power in the 30s. In 1935, Ben Gurion actually writes the following. I want to quote to you what Ben Gurion said. A great lucidity with which he saw the future. The disaster which has befallen German Jewry is not limited to Germany alone. Hitler's regime places the entire Jewish people in danger, and not the Jewish people alone. Hitler's regime cannot long survive without a war of revenge against France, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and against Soviet Russia. This was Ben Gurion in 1935, years before the invasion of Poland and World War II. So let me talk a little bit about what was happening on the other side. In the world, in the 30s, Mussolini extends its influence in the Middle East. Germany helps Mussolini, and it begins to spread its tentacles onto the Arabs. And the Arabs who now hate Britain, hate Jews, they begin to want to associate themselves with Hitler, and the Mufti of Jerusalem eventually is going to run away because the British are going to prosecute him, run away from Palestine and move to Berlin, from where he broadcasts propaganda to the Arab people, saying that when the Nazis enter Palestine, we'll be able to take care of all the Jews and we will establish an Arab state for our own. This is the alliance between Nazis, Germany, and the Arabs. This is, unfortunately, the people with whom some people have wanted to make peace. I'll leave it up to you to see if these Arabs have changed today. However, I want to point out that there may have been some possible Arab leaders who may have wanted to make peace with the Jews. And there were Jews who were willing to do that. Of course, Jabotinsky didn't believe it was possible. But Ben Gurion thought it was possible. Weizmann thought it was possible. And they wanted to have community. But the people who torpedoed the meetings were the British, because the British wanted to keep the power, the famous divide and conquer. They did not want the Arabs and the Jews to work together. But the Jews, the British begins to tilt their support towards the Arabs. They begin to talk about Arab independence. We all know about Lawrence of Arabia. The generals in general, Allenby and other British generals, were all anti-Zionists. They did not want the Jews. They did not understand that the Jews had a right to be in this. They considered Palestine, as many people today in the State Department, is like an Arab place. What are the Jews doing there? Never mind that the Jews built this was the place where the Jewish people were born, Abraham, Isaac, and the patriarchs, and Joshua, and King David, and Solomon. They forget about that. It's now an Arab place. The Jews have nothing to do with it. This is the tragedy. The Jews do not have a place in Europe, and they do not have a place in Palestine. Sadly, in Europe, they say Jews go home, and in Palestine, they say Jews go back, go no home. This is the tragedy of the Jewish people. So, and I think that part of the resentment of the Arabs about the Jews was although the Arabs were doing better financially, economically, there were 100,000 Arabs came in the course of a few years in the 30s to Israel, to Palestine, because of the economic opportunities provided by the Jewish businesses. The Arab middle class was becoming richer. They were doing very well because of the Jewish opportunities. The problem was that the Jews were doing even better. So they were envious of them. How could it be that people with so many scientists, literary people, business, industrialists, and they were envious of them? And so the Arab resentment begins to push again to by the way, in the fifth Aliyah, which takes place in the 30s, from 1933 to 1935, brings about almost 300,000 Jews to Palestine, fleeing particularly Germany. Interesting, but as a point of reference, that in Germany, there were clubs organizing people to make Aliyah. And before they made Aliyah, they had what is called Akshara, groups of training centers. They're preparing them to be carpenters, to be plumbers. So when they came to Israel, they had a profession, something to do. So Eichmann, in the 30s, was actually supporting these training camps because he wanted the Jews to get out. Eventually, he had another idea of how to get out the Jews. So there are many Jews coming to Israel, and the Arabs continue to have more resentment. And so in April 1936, the Arabs stopped a bus with Jewish passengers and killing 2 people. In response, the Jews killed 2 Arabs. And then there were other acts of violence, one on another. And Britain imposes a curfew. The Mufti of Jerusalem encourages more armed rebellion, 1936. And in 1936, they create another commission called the Peel Commission. And I want to point out, in 1936, this Peel Commission, before the white paper, it begins to think, what can we do? Can we solve the problem of the Arabs and the Jews? And at this time, Britain is going to begin its repudiation of its dream of the Jewish national home. First of all, they begin to suggest a partition. So there should be one part of it for the Jews, one part of it for the Arabs. And the partition map is absurd, very, very small part. I think they were recommending 1/20th of the original Palestine would be given to the Jews. Some Jews are happy because they, as they were when there was a final partition, because at least we're going to have a place that's only for us. The alternative would have been to stay in Palestine, let the Arabs be the majority, which they were demographically, and then the Jews would be a minority. It would be an Arab state, with the Jews living in, again, not in a Jewish state. And that essentially is what the Peel Commission actually, in the end, recommends. So, in fact, when the idea of partition was floated, Ben Gurion, in 1937, offered the Arabs, they would make their own state. He offered them financial assistance, in exchange of which all he wanted was that the Arabs should accept or recognize a Jewish state. Does it sound familiar? We're in the same boat in 2021 as we were in 1937. We are begging the Arabs to recognize a Jewish state. Some people love the idea of a partition. Weizmann. Ben Gurion is happy with the idea, but he had something up his sleeve. He wanted to say, yeah, we'll accept it for now, but eventually we're going to attack them and we're going to maybe throw the Arabs out, or we're going to make our own state. And Jabotinsky openly opposes it. The Arabs, all of them, oppose it. Absolutely. They do not want to see any cooperation. So again, the Arabs continue to enter into that world of saying no. So the Arab revolt continues. Arab opinion praises Nazi Germany and Mussolini, and there is Nazi propaganda in Palestine. It's interesting, the Nazis in Palestine mobilized the Knights Templar. There was a group of German religious people who had moved to Israel, in particular in Jerusalem and in Jaffa, and they asked them to join the Nazi party. But at this time, I want to point out, the Jews are not know about nothing. By 1936, the Jewish community in Palestine is actually a very serious community. The national home is firmly established. There are about 400,000 Jews in a quasi-government with their own schools, their own hospitals, and now they're going to have their own defense. One British Scot with a strong Protestant religious upbringing, Ord Wingate, comes and helps, creates famous in Wingate Institute today. He helps the Jews organize the defense, teaches them, organizes the Palmach, and organizes a lot of Jewish groups. In fact, of defense, he devised new tactics against the Arabs. He actually is quoted as saying, "I count it as my privilege to help you fight your battle." End of quote. Ord Wingate. So the Jews are beginning to organize groups of self-defense. The Haganah is created under Yitzhak Sadeh, which is part of the labor side, whereas we saw that Jabotinsky had created another paramilitary organization called the Irgun Tzva'i Leumi, the Etzel. So by 1939, in the middle of all these attack and counterattacks, the bond between Zionism and Britain is snapped. And MacDonald and other traditionally hostile British who are hostile to Zionism want to repudiate the mandate. And they write this 1939 white paper. I want to point out that what they wanted was essentially, they thought it was fairness. There are more Arabs than Jews, so therefore we have to give the Arabs more rights. When Weizmann comes to the meeting with MacDonald and he has this proposal of having to curtail Jewish immigration, Jews are not allowed to go into Palestine anymore in small numbers, to give the Arabs the power over the Jews, to create essentially going to be an Arab state. Weizmann comes out of that meeting pale and trembling. How could they do that, he said. Now, in fact, many Britain also say this is the repudiation of the Balfour Declaration. And this is 1939, exactly when the Jews in Europe are facing a mortal threat. What a terrible time. The paper of 1939, by the way, it's issued after a conference in London in February 1939, at which time Arabs refused to sit in the same room as Jews, and the British acquiesced by putting them in separate rooms. The paper will limit Jewish immigration. They will not allow sale of land to Jews. Jews could no longer buy land in Palestine, all as European Jewry was facing a mortal threat. Why did they do it? Because they did not want the Arabs to go into the Nazi axis. Churchill is terribly appalled about this and says the Pledge of Asylum was not made for the Jews of Palestine, but for the Jews who are persecuted in the world. And by doing this, you're preventing them from being saved. Terrible. And in reaction to this paper, the paramilitary Etzel bombs a few buildings in Jerusalem. So immigration to East Palestine is a matter of life and death for the Jews. And Britain declares a death sentence to many Jews. We will see exactly what's going to happen with illegal immigration during the time of the war and after the war as well. The person who led this effort was none other than Neville Chamberlain, the same one who signed the Munich Treaty with believing that Hitler could be bought. He wanted to appease Hitler and appease the Arabs at the same time. It was a calculated move of self-interest for oil, to be pro-Arab in defense of British economic interests. The Jews saw it as a death warrant to the idea of a Jewish state. Weizmann is in Geneva at a Zionist Congress, August 24, 1939. 6 days before Germany would invade Poland and the Second World War would start. As he leaves the conference, realizing the threat to the Jews, realizing the treason, the betrayal by the British, and realizing what was happening, he embraces the delegates as he leaves with tears in his eyes. Weizmann is returning to Palestine. And many of these delegates did not survive the war. And this ends in 1939, the period when the final betrayal of Britain, the undoing of the Balfour Declaration, the great act of treason against the Jewish people, is beginning. And now we're going to witness what are the Jewish responses. The rise of the militancy of the Jewish people, the self-defense, the awareness, as all of them agreed, that the destiny had to be in our hands, that we could not leave it in anybody else's. So it's interesting that Herzl's idea of creating a Jewish state had been, first of all, to be recognized by the powers and nations of the world. So in a way, Herzl was aiming at some sort of acceptance or invitation by the nations of the world to say, we accept the Jewish nation. And that's essentially what went on from 1900s when Herzl started the work until 1939. In one way or another, particularly through Britain and the League of Nations, the world was agreeing, accepting the concept of a Jewish state. But from 1939 onward, the Jewish state has to live on its own, despite or even against the wish and the desire and the thoughts of other nations, be it the State Department of the United States or the British Foreign Office or any of the other nations of the world. And that essentially is what we're going to see now in the next decade, after 1939, after we've seen the betrayal, the hatred of Britain, the indifference of America, and worse from other countries. The Jewish people realize the destiny is in our hands, and we have to do it. And that begins now one of the most glorious decades in Jewish history, the decades of the 40s, during the war, after the war, until the Declaration of Independence. That we're going to see, God willing, in the next class.